A confirmation about the audio, please, guys. If the audio is clear and available, kindly confirm the same. Thank you. Pranay, global biodiversity framework is equally important as Paris Agreement. In a way, you can say for the conservation of biodiversity, yes. But then when we talk about the immediate threat when it comes to the loss of biodiversity or the immediate threat in respect of climate change, so that is where Paris Agreement is much more relevant, and Paris Agreement goes a long way about it. Okay, and when it comes to the global biodiversity framework, there is not a greater adherence and agreement to the fact that how the biodiversity needs to be conserved and so on. So, in a way, yes, you can say that, but in many ways, Paris Agreement is much more relevant and much more important. So, hello, good morning to all of you, and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to another session of Environment and Ecology, where yesterday we had been discussing about the portion of pollution. We had discussed in detail about the portion of air pollution, the relevant government legislations for the same, about the ozone hole, the causation of ozone hole and the ozone depletion. How is it that we end up measuring the ozone layer in terms of its concentration? Why is it that it is depleting, and why is it that it is also healing itself? We had also been discussing about the relevant protocols in the form of the Montreal Protocol as well as the Kigali Amendment to that. Now, today we are going to carry further that discussion. We are going to carry further the discussion about the water, land, and noise pollution for a bit. And then we are also going to take a look into the waste management. What are the various methodologies by which the waste can be managed and is managed? What is the principle involved behind that and the government legislations for that? And then after that, we shall be moving ahead into the ever important chapter of climate change. Why is it that the climate is changing? Is it something which is absolutely new, or is it something which has happened before as well? If it has happened before, then why is it that we are also worried this at this point of time? So that is something that we are going to hold a discussion for, and then eventually we are going to transition into the portion of biodiversity. So today's class timings, I hope everybody is aware of. So we are going to have a lunch break from 1 to 2, and then after that we are going to take a break at around 5. So in between we will take a short break just to keep you alive and awake as well, and that is how we shall be proceeding ahead for the day till 8 p.m. So we start with the portion of the causes of water pollution. What are the various causes when it comes to water pollution? Now, in water pollution, we had discussed about the occurrence of freshwater surface pollution, and we had also held a discussion about the groundwater pollution. That what are the various different reasons due to which the groundwater appears to be absolutely polluted. So, overall, when we take a look at the reasons for the water pollution, we can narrow it down to certain areas. For example, we have the occurrence of oil spills and accidents. Now, oil spills and accidents overall, they are one of the larger reasons and a major causes for marine pollution. In marine areas, this is something which happens quite at a disturbing rate. It is not something which is very frequent, but whenever it does happen, it creates a very large impact on the biodiversity as well as on the ecosystem. Why? Because, and what is this oil spill? So historically, this oil spill has happened because of various different reasons. It can be attributed to as simple a reason, for example, when we talk about a large oil container carrying significant amount of oil, when that starts leaking due to maybe a breakage or a leakage in the ships, when the ship weathers a storm or when there is a defect in the ship, that is when the crude oil which is carried, that starts to spill over. Now the crude oil basically is significantly heavier than the petroleum, etc., that we end up using, because the crude oil consists of all the heavy particles such as tar, etc. So that crude oil, when it spreads itself over a particular region, as you can see here, now it immediately forms a kind of a blockage for the availability of sunlight. So this immediately blocks the sunlight, blocks the availability of sunlight. Okay. Now, when that sunlight is blocked, thereby the productivity of the marine plants or the marine ecosystem in itself, that will be significantly hampered, and there will be no production of energy. So that ends up creating a kind of a dead zone, creates dead zones in the process. Dead zones are what? Where the amount of dissolved oxygen is absolutely very, very low, and basically you cannot have adequate conditions to support life anymore. So that is why in these regions you will find that for a very long period of time you have a kind of the species of fishes, etc., finding themselves lifeless and floating on the surface of the water, and you have mass deaths and mass fish kills which do happen. Now, sometimes it is also caused by the accidents. Accidents such as collision, collision of various different ships or vessels, that sometimes ends up damaging the engine compartment and the heavy engine oil that starts to leak. Now, the crude oil is still comparatively less dangerous as compared to the heavy engine oil that the ships carry, because these heavy engine oils, they have a tendency to be slightly heavier in certain cases, and they will end up settling even at the bottom. Many of the species, they get slithered with that oil, and that is where their entire productivity, their entire livability, that is damaged. So this is something which is very disastrous. One of the recent incidents which have happened in the region of the southern part of Bay of Bengal, where a crude oil carrying container actually started leaking that oil due to a fire which started raging. So whenever this happens, it has got a long term impact in the ecosystem as well. Okay. Now, eutrophication also creates dead zones. Yes, eutrophication, pollution, all of them are able to create those dead zones. Now, when we talk about this oil spill, how is it that you cater to oil spill? How is it that you treat the oil spill? So there are certain ways and mannerisms by which these are treated, and technologies have come into the force as well. So one of the very easy methods or the newer methods which have come is basically skimming up the top portion of the oil spill, because in certain cases the crude oil, it tends to float on top. It, because oil in general is lighter in density, so it tends to float on top. So with the help of skimmers, significant amount of that oil is segregated, it is separated, and then that waste is actually taken away. But sometimes what can also be done, or what is also done, is the methodology of bioremediation. And here, what is bioremediation is something that we will study in greater detail later on. But when we talk about bioremediation, the name in itself is self-explanatory in a way. That is, by biological methodologies, you are providing a kind of a remedy to any kind of disaster. So here, when you have, let's say, an oil spill, a significant amount of oil spill, so with the help of microbial action and with the help of the microbes, there is a augmentation at the rate of decomposition which can happen, because even this oil spill or any wastage can be worked upon by the microorganisms which can break down these complex carbohydrates, make it more digestible, and eventually that can be taken in by the natural ecosystem. So here you have certain types of very natural or certain types of microbes which have also been developed, which consume that oil and which break down this particular oil spill. So for example, you have the microbes such as oilivorous, oil zapper. These microbial actions, when they are initiated, or these microbes, when they are introduced into these regions of the spill, that is when you have a significant amount of that spill being taken care of. Okay. Now, then we have the various other methodologies by which the water pollution is caused. For example, we have the sewage and the wastewater. So, untreated sewage and untreated wastewater, when it is simply discharged into the nearby water body, the pollution cost is quite apparent and significant. Now, these sewage and wastewater, they can lead to overloading of nutrients. And which nutrients get overloaded by this? You have the nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphate. They get overloaded. So, because phosphate is a significant component in the wastewater and also sewage. So, water gets overloaded with nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphates. Now, when it gets overloaded with any of these, that is nitrogen or phosphates, that leads to what? It leads to perfect eutrophication. And that can lead to harmful algal bloom. And this eventually will also end up creating dead zones in the process. Okay, this is one of the methods or one of the reasons why many of the coastal waters are significantly eutrophied and significant amount of dead zones are created across the coastline. And also, when it comes to freshwater pollution, this is one of the major causes of freshwater pollution as well. Then we have the process of mining. As we have had a discussion about it yesterday as well, that the process of mining is also significantly a source of pollution, because when you carry out mining, you basically break the various different rock fragments, you disintegrate them, and then let's suppose you spray it with water, because in the process of mining significant amount of water consumption is also there. So that is where, when you do utilize them, when you do utilize these particular various different rock extracts, many of the heavy materials and heavy metals such as mercury, arsenic, selenium, these are leached into the ground surface. And if they are leached into the ground surface, they can pollute the groundwater. Otherwise, they will accumulate on the surface itself, and along with the runoff water, they can accumulate themselves in a nearby pond, in a nearby river, causing lot of pollution in the process. For example, take the case of river Damodar. Now, River Damodar, which moves through the region of Chota Nagpur Plateau, actually moves through or drains through an area which is significantly rich in terms of mineral deposits. And mining is carried out in very significant quantities in those areas. And a lot of mining waste, which is carried out even in unorganized sector. Now, in unorganized sector, there is no accountability how you handle those waste. Nobody is there to take an account of that, because you in itself, many of the cases, you are running the business illegally. So that is the case in many of the situations, not all the situations, but in many of the situations. So whenever that incident happens or that event unfolds, then river starts getting polluted, and the river does not support life anymore. So you can take the example of river Subarnarekha, again moving through the Chota Nagpur Plateau, river Damodar, again moving through Chota Nagpur Plateau. These are few of the rivers which account for significant amount of these mining waste. Okay. Eutrophication we have covered earlier itself, isn't it? The last week we covered in detail about eutrophication, Gulam. Are you not aware about the eutrophication entirely, or is it something about eutrophication that you are having a doubt about? Because eutrophication, we had discussed that how eutrophication happens, how that eutrophication leads to, and or that is caused by the overloading of nutrients, and that can lead to the harmful algal bloom, where blue green algae or sometimes even red or brownish algae can start to bloom. So that is also something which is devastating. Okay, is that understood? River Subarnarekha Avni, it is said to have gold deposits or placer deposits at one point of time, and you had a lot of people who were indulging in the economic activity of that gold extraction, which would be get deposited in very tiny pellets on the riverbed. But now, and that happened during the British era as well. But now there is not much of a gold to be found across that river. Okay. I see in Pacific Ocean, many NGOs are cleaning waste. It's supported by the government or not? So, not many of the governments have taken a part in that, because when it comes to cleaning of the Pacific, that is where, see, governments will always end up morally supporting you when you are carrying out these activities. But when it comes to logistics, etc., many of the governments, they basically they shed their responsibility by the basic reasoning that this is not in our national jurisdiction, so why should we pool in our resources, or why should we spend our resources? Having said that, there is an increasing consensus and an increasing awareness which has been raised by these NGOs. They have started putting out these videos quite significantly. So few of the governments, they have provided some of the resources. For example, the survey ships, the survey vessels, etc., have been provided. But still, this cleaning of the Pacific is largely carried out by the NGOs itself. Nitrogen and phosphate point C, untreated sewage and wastewater. What is the untreated sewage and wastewater consisting of? So, sewage has got many of the various different components. Phosphate is one of the larger components, and wastewater, which is generated from the various industries, that can have heavy minerals and heavy contaminants as well. But then, amongst them, phosphates and nitrogen are also included. So that is why these are the primary ones which will cause eutrophication in the process. The other various different nutrients which are provided, they also, or the other various different wastes which are provided, they will also carry out eutrophication. But these are the significant amount of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphate. Okay. Then we have agriculture and agricultural runoff. So when you spray various different fertilizers, for example, various different chemicals, pesticides, etc., now these can include some of the heavy pollutants such as dioxins, and some of the pollutants, the common pollutants such as the nitrates, phosphates, potash, etc. Now, all of this eventually, because even when you talk about the farmlands, now if there is a rainfall or if there is an irrigation that you provide, now many of the times that particular chemical starts moving along with that wastewater or the runoff water, tends to accumulate in the nearby pond or the nearby river, or in certain cases, even in the coastal areas, it can get accumulated or find its way into the coastal marine waters. In certain cases, it can also leach into the or seep into the underground level and end up causing groundwater pollution. Okay, so agricultural waste can end up causing both the surface as well as the groundwater pollution. Then you have marine dumping. Now, what is known or what is referred to by marine dumping? So this basically talks about the dumping of the marine of the waste into the marine areas. Now this has been a long practice, which now thankfully has come to a kind of a halt or a kind of a slow stop, so to say, where for a very long period of time you had a scenario where all the various different waste which was accumulated, now because you did not have any jurisdiction over the waters and nobody is there to pinpoint that why are you throwing the waste in the water, many of the countries have dumped a large amount of waste into the marine region. Now that starts with the coastal waters, but it eventually ends up into the center portion of the ocean as well. Now this marine dumping, be it the plastic waste, be it any other kind of waste or the heavy toxicants and contaminants. Now, in the case of the plastics, the results are much more drastic and much more dangerous, because when you start dumping the plastic waste, that plastic, owing to the salinity of the water and owing to the heat by the sun, that plastic starts disintegrating into small micro beads, and these microbeads, then they can get entangled into the respiratory tract of the aquatic organisms, the marine organisms, and also by the process of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, the entire food chain can get contaminated, and there is a long term damage which is experienced in the marine areas. So this can include coastal waste dumping. This would include marine wastes. Okay, that can be included in this. Then we have leakage from landfills. So when we say leakage from landfills, what are landfills? So again, this is something that we'll introduce ourselves at a later point of time. So when we talk about landfill, so this is a methodology of waste disposal. Now, this is not carried out significant in an organic manner or in a scientific manner, and there is no longer any rules or regulations which are observed. But landfill also has got a kind of a basic rule that you need to follow in order to dump the waste in the landfill, that you generally end up dumping organic waste, so that in the landfill that organic waste is decomposed and you have the organic nutrients of the soil which are recharged, or you have the formation of, let's say, organic manure. So what is this landfill? The name in itself tells you landfill, where some portion of the land is filled up. So here, for example, let's suppose you have a land which has been excavated, a portion of land which has been, let's suppose, excavated. Why? In order to dump the waste. And then after that, it is covered by a thin film or a thin layer of soil on top. A thin film or a thin layer of soil on top. Now, ideally, in these landfills, we should fill only, or we should dump only the organic matter, so that in the presence of these organic matter, in the presence of the perfect conditions, this might get decomposed. But what is generally followed is a complete violation of these norms. So, be it the plastic waste, the metal waste, the chemical waste, everything is disposed of in the landfill. So, that is where all that landfill, when it is compressed from the weight on top, so that is when the chemical toxins, etc., they start seeping down, and they will pollute what? The groundwater. So this leakage from landfill can pollute the groundwater. But it is not only always going to be restricted to the groundwater, because sometimes what can also happen, that due to this compression, the leakage starts happening in the sideways as well, and due to the compression, all the toxins, they start leaking from the sides. So then they can be carried out by the surface runoff water during rainfall, etc., and that will, in the form of the drains, etc., end up finding themselves in the nearby lakes or ponds or the river channel. So that is the leakage from landfill. Then you have industrial effluents and also radioactive waste. Radioactive waste, they can be generated from the chemical industry, they can be generated from the pharmaceutical industry, and they can also be generated from the nuclear industry. So you have medicinal waste which can also be radioactive in certain cases. You also have the occurrence of, let's say, industrial waste in certain cases, where certain elements and certain isotopes of chemicals, they can also end up being radioactive. So if these wastes are not treated well and are directly discharged, that can end up causing a water pollution as well. Now, this is a chart for your prelims. This is something that you can refer for your prelims. Okay. relevant for prelims. This tells you about the types of water pollution, the causes of pollution, that which are the contaminants which causes those pollutions, and what happens when that pollution happens. In majority of the cases, you will find that when pollution happens, then the survivability of the species is at question. Why? Because whenever that pollution does occur, there is an increased amount of creation of dead zones. The dissolved oxygen is consumed, and then in these dead zones the species won't be able to survive. Now also this pollution ends up impacting us as well, because many of the times these pollutant waters, they enter into the bloodstream, they enter, or rather they enter into the food chain, and by the process of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, they can impact the larger species. For example, mercury poisoning. Now mercury poisoning is one of the major causes of concern for large sections of the population in larger areas of the globe. Now this mercury poisoning happens because of the industrial waste. Now many of the times this industrial waste is untreated, and some amount of mercury, and mercury is one of those toxicants and toxins, when they are discharged in even the smallest of the quantity, they will end up impacting the entirety of the region. The entirety of the aquatic ecosystem gets impacted by that. Now in those situations, that mercury, when it is consumed by the fishes, in trace amounts it gets consumed by the fishes, and those fishes, when consumed by us, it causes nervous disorders as well, and what is famously referred to as the Minamata disease. So that is again how the wastewater has ended up causing significant amount of diseases amongst us as well. Similarly, you have many other different types of waste and different types of contaminants which cause different types of diseases amongst us. So we'll take a look at them as well. So when we talk about the various different types of health cost or the health detriments which happen because of this pollution, so you can see that when you have fluoride poisoning or fluoride contamination, the basic bones, they start getting damaged. So you have brittle bones or teeth, joint impairment, and also damage to the thyroid gland. When you have the arsenic poisoning, which is very very common nowadays, particularly in the northern part of the country, in the plain region of the country, especially the river plains of the Yamuna, the Ganga, etc. Now there you can have skin cancer, lungs can get impacted, then even kidney can get damaged. So here you have certain contaminants. For example, let's suppose you have nitrate contamination. This is also relevant for your prelims. For prelims. Nitrate contamination. So nitrate contamination, it basically ends up producing, it reacts with the blood, and it ends up impacting the hemoglobin, right? So what kind of disease does nitrate poisoning cause? Yes, previous slide is also relevant only for your prelims. So nitrate contamination causes which kind of disease? Are we aware of that? It basically deprives your blood of the presence of oxygen. And once the hemoglobin in itself, because hemoglobin is the one which carries that oxygen to the various different parts of the body. So if the hemoglobin in itself reacts and forms a different compound altogether, it won't be able to carry oxygen anymore to the cells, particularly in the young ones, particularly in the infants. The impact is so significant that the body starts turning blue. And that is what is referred to as the blue baby syndrome. Baby syndrome. Okay, where the body starts turning blue because of lack of oxygen. Then when we talk about fluoride, fluoride, it ends up causing fluorosis, where basically The bones, as we have already seen, the bones get impacted, are impacted. Then after that, we also have, let's suppose, cadmium, mercury, arsenic. So what happens due to cadmium poisoning and cadmium contamination? Are we aware of that? What is the resultant of, or what is the outcome of the cadmium poisoning? In Telangana, one district severely impacted by fluoride. Yes. And not only in Telangana, my dear friend, even in Karnataka. And that tells you, and why is it that fluoride and arsenic contamination is happening is primarily because of excessive amount of extraction of the groundwater. And that is when you have basically the entirety of the nutrients or the minerals present, many of them, they get overloaded in the extraction of the groundwater. And slowly and steadily groundwater has got a connect with the rivers, and in the smaller streams, where when we talk about Himalayan rivers, they consistently are fed with the melting of the snow and ice, but there also you have a connect with the groundwater. So that is where, if the groundwater gets significantly contaminated, that is when you will observe that even these areas, or even the smaller streams, seasonal streams, they also get impacted significantly. Now, due to cadmium contamination, the bones of the or the joints and the bones, they become very brittle. So, or they become significantly hardened. So normally when we have the joints of the bones, they can operate or they can move over each other easily, right? But then when the mass in between them is consumed because of cadmium contamination, that movement of the joint becomes very, very impossible and very painful. So this is what is also able to cause itai itai or ouch ouch disease. Okay, itai itai or ouch ouch disease is caused by that. Then after that, mercury poisoning, we have already talked about that it causes Minamata disease. We'll study about Minamata disease and Minamata convention. Then arsenic contamination leads to what kind of disease? It is the Blackfoot disease. Sometimes you have lead, and lead contamination. Lead is something which we have also seen in the case of indoor air pollution. But then that lead, which nowadays is not so significantly used, but that lead, as you would observe in the region of plumbing materials, many of the plumbing materials and the plumbing pipes, they still use lead. Now when that ends up contaminating the supply water, that will damage the nervous system, and the nerves, they start becoming blunt, and the sensitivity reduces. So that is the impact of lead contamination as well. Nerve damage. So in this particular portion, you can expect a match the following kind of a question. Match the following type of question can be framed from here. Okay, now here is a kind of a data which is not something that I want you to learn. This is not something that I want you to reproduce immediately in the examination. I want you to observe the trend here. This indicates the river pollution, the state of river pollution in India. And overall, you will see that one state which maintains its dominance throughout, that is basically the state of Maharashtra. So be it in 2009, be it in 2015, be it in 2018, and so on, the state of Maharashtra has has basically witnessed a significant amount of river pollution, and river contamination is very high. And after that, you would observe that while earlier you had the state of Gujarat, which was in the second number in terms of the amount of pollution. Now, then it was overtaken by Assam, and Assam has maintained that amount of contamination level, and that contamination level has increased over the period of time. So, what are the causes here? Causes of high level of contamination. In the case of the rivers, what can be the causes? Urbanization, okay. Increased urbanization, then mining, okay. Mining waste, particularly in the region of when we talk about the Chandrapur area and the Godavari basin of Maharashtra, there is significant amount of mining. Then good industrial discharge, untreated industrial discharge. Then after that, solid waste management, okay. So can we write lack of STPs, sewage treatment plants? Now, this sewage treatment plants basically are very, very important. See, just establishing a basic, now we have to have an appreciation, first of all. Many of the times, while taking a look at the problems, we basically forget the long way that we have come through. So we have to have an appreciation that at least in many of the areas, now we can talk that okay, in this area there is no toilet, this area there is no toilet. But if you take a scenario around 20-25 years back, that was not a point of discussion at all, whether there are toilets or not, because majority of the areas they lack toilets. Majority of the areas, for them it was very common and a matter of day to day exercise that what is the need of the toilets. At least due to social discussion, there is an increased social awareness, due to which in many of the areas the district administration has been pressured into opening up and establishing toilets. So these toilets have at least been established, which is a point of celebration, not in fact celebration, but a point of definite achievement, which as a country, as a society, we have managed to do so. But then here, just the opening up or establishment of toilets will not solve the entirety of the purpose. While it takes care of the open defecation, but many of the time that untreated sewage is discharged into the nearby lake, the nearby pond, the nearby river, and so on. So that is why you do need the establishment of sewage treatment plants. And these sewage treatment plants, they are not a very attractive investment. If your local MP will come to your house or in your locality and they will tell you that, you know what, I have put all the money in establishing two sewage treatment plants, which will get established in 4 years. And the impact of cleaner water is something that you will see in the next 7 years. Nobody will get impressed by that. But if the local MP comes to your house and gives you 5,000 rupees, you are more likely to vote for him in the next particular election. You might not do so, but I'm talking about the general public behavior as it happens. I'm not talking about any particular political angle here. I'm just talking about the public behavior which has been witnessed and which is witnessed across the globe. So that is why sewage treatment plants are not a very attractive investment. So majority of the under investment that we talk about, that happens in the case of opening up the STPs, because STPs have a long gestation period of establishment as well, and that is where the maintenance of it is also required. So lack of STPs in many of the urban areas across the river valleys and across the river systems, that directly contributes to the pollution which is created. Okay, so that is where lack of STPs need to be highlighted quite sufficiently, and this comes in tandem with the increased rate of urbanization. As more people are living across, and there is an increased amount of urbanization. Increased amount of urbanization means what? There will be more migration into the urban areas, and when we talk about the migrant workers, they don't live in posh societies and posh colonies in a newly established urban area. They all end up establishing a kind of a shanty or a slum setup in the floodplains of the river. And it is there in the floodplains where continuously that untreated sewage is discharged. So that is why you need the STPs. Okay. Now, then after that, what can be the other conditions? Exports and imports through ships. But then that inland water transport and inland water trade, Avni, is still not something which is very pertinent. Here, you have the, as indicated by one of you earlier as well, you have also the case of sand mining. Whenever you carry out incessant and unsustainable level of sand mining on the riverbeds, that will expose the riverbeds to various different types of contaminants as well. Okay, so settlements near the riverbeds, you have to include Pranay in the portion of increased urbanization. Just writing increased urbanization won't do. Okay, then you have solid waste dumping. Now, another factor that you have to identify and you have to understand is when we talk, Divyanshu, microplastics will be created by the solid waste dumping itself. That is what will end up creating the microplastic. Sangam will talk about the symptoms of Minamata disease. It causes nerve damage. Now, a nuclear power plant, see, in our country nowadays, the and for a long period of time, because we don't have very large number of nuclear power plants, so we have a considerable amount of responsible treatment for the nuclear power plants as well, for the nuclear waste which is generated as well. So another thing that you have to be aware of is that in the floodplains of the river, there is a frequent deposit of silt, the deposit which is carried out by the river. So that is where you have a very frequent deposit which is carried out. Now, that makes the river plains and the river floodplains very fertile. Now, in these floodplains, that is basically not a land that you and I can buy. That is not a government, or that is not a private owned property. That is something which is there for the river, that in the city's master plan itself, it is reserved for the river flow in itself. Now, utilizing that, many of the people, especially in the unorganized sector, the landless laborers, they start agriculture in those particular floodplains. And when they start cultivation there, initially, they start cultivation by growing some small crops or a small seasonal crop, so that they are able to vacate that land whenever the authorities come there, or basically whenever the authorities come there with the request of vacating the land, they would vacate the land. But then, slowly and steadily, as the authorities do not take a lot of action, slowly and steadily that gets changed into a consistent agricultural farming, and that generates a lot of agricultural waste that we have already talked about. In the region of Assam, when we talk about the Brahmaputra plains, and we also talk about the region of Godavari river valley, in all these areas, that agricultural waste is getting accumulated in large proportion. So here you have the agricultural waste. Then after that, you have construction waste. This is a common sight in your nearby river areas. If you would have observed, the construction materials are freely dumped. Now that also creates a lot of river pollution, because the construction waste, we think about it that okay, this is cement, how will it pollute, or this is sand, how will it pollute? But many of those cement mixtures, etc., they also consist of heavy contaminants, and that has got a significant tendency to pollute. So this is a uh, these are few of the reasons. Now if a question is framed on this, that mention the reasons or elaborate or discuss and examine the reasons for river contamination, I expect you to bring these particular points and then write a couple of sentences on the minimum for each of these points. That will help you easily encompass close to around 150 words very easily for any kind of answer here. Okay. Now, the river contamination, this is just a kind of an ideation about how the various different areas they end up witnessing different types of contaminants in the rivers. So you can see that you have very heavy contaminants included as well. And for example, take the case of chromium. Now, chromium is a contaminant which is basically released from which industry? Are we aware of the industry specific discharge of chromium? Iron industry, okay. Other than that, you have the leather industry. Now whenever you talk about the leather industry, the leather tanneries for example, which basically treat the leather and then use it for various different purposes. Now large section of our leather industry is in unorganized sector, and that means they are still using very old techniques and technologies. Now you cannot order the sudden shutdown of these industries, because obviously that forms a very important part of the vote bank. And also leather industry is a labor intensive industry. That is, it forms an employment source for a very large section of the population. So whenever you carry out the cleaning and the tanning of the river or of leather, that is when significant amount of chromium is utilized and chromium is discharged in the process. So for example, if you take a look at the pollution of river Ganga around the region of Kanpur. Now that is Kanpur is referred to as one of the hubs of this leather industry. Lot of people, lot of various different industries, they are operating. Lot of people are finding employment there. Now if you recall the newspaper headlines when you had a national lockdown during COVID pandemic, you would have recalled about the various headlines that how river Ganga water has become very clean and so on. Now that was because many of these tanneries were shut down. So that is where these tanneries, once they basically they start deploying modern machineries, or let's suppose these tanneries they filter out the chromium, it will bring about an automatic cleaning process. But then obviously because of various different reasons they still operate the same, and that is why the problem persists. So chromium contamination happens because of that. Yes, electric industry or the thermal power plants, they are also one of the sources of heavy contaminants. Okay, so selenium, mercury, etc., they are also discharged, because from these power plants, thermal power plants in particular, thermal power plants include what? Burning up of coal. Now when you burn coal, you generate what is referred to as fly ash. Fly ash consists of silicates, alumina, and various different heavy contaminants. Now, that when it is discharged without getting treated into the river, as is being done still in many of the areas, so that will lead to significant amount of contamination. Foam that you see which is formed in the river, or in certain cases even in the cases of the lakes, that is basically a resultant of primarily the chemicals which are there, the chemical reaction which happens, and many of the times it is also because of the bacterium and the microbial growth which causes that. So it will always be created due to heavy amount of chemical contamination which will happen into the rivers. For example, river Yamuna in Delhi, especially during the months from now on, you will observe, and even now you would observe that there is a significant amount of foam which starts to develop in, for example, another region which is quite defamed for that is the very famous Belandur Lake of Bangalore. And that again is because of the contamination, untreated wastewater and sewage. So basically, untreated wastewater and untreated sewage, when it is directly put into the water, that will contaminate, and eventually the microbial growth and the chemical reaction that will form the foams. People enjoy it. Isn't it dangerous? It is absolutely dangerous, my dear friend. People enjoy it because ignorance is bliss. As long as you are not aware that you are floating or you are taking a dip near poison, you will be very happy. But then it causes long term illnesses and skin diseases as well. Many of the times, those chemicals, because when you take a dip in that foamy water, some of that water is also ingested and it causes digestive tract issues, many of the bladder infections, etc. Now, understand, it is not a fault of the people who are enjoying that, because see, the bladder, the long term bladder damage or the long term digestive tract illnesses that you will observe or that you will experience, that is not something which you will correlate that, okay, one fine day I was taking a bath in river Yamuna, so that is why I have fallen ill. You will basically attribute it to some or the other reasons. So many of the times we are not even aware of the illnesses caused by the pollution. That is why ignorance is bliss. Now, in order to treat the water pollution or the menace of water pollution, the government has basically launched various programs, including the Namami Gange program, the Ganga cleaning program, etc. But first action which was taken, the first major legislation which was taken to combat any kind of pollution by the government was the Water Act 1974. This was the first act which was passed, the first legislation which was passed to tackle pollution in India. And this was also a resultant of the deliberations and the conclusions which were arrived at the Stockholm Convention 1972. So, also a resultant of the outcomes of Stockholm Convention, or Stockholm Conference rather, not convention. Stockholm Conference 1972. Okay, it was one of the first legislations for tackling the portion of pollution. Now, problem of pollution. Now, as per this act, there was a statutory body which was established. And what was that statutory body which was established in order to take care and tackle about pollution? We had discussed it yesterday. Very good, Binita. So, as per this provisions, you had the establishment of CPCB, Central Pollution Control Board. Central Pollution Control Board. Now, this Central Pollution Control Board would act as a nodal agency at the central level, and basically it would also be a coordinator of the various state pollution control boards, the various different state pollution control boards. Okay. Now, later, with the help of the various different amendments, the power, the actual enforcing ability of the CPCB and the SPCBs have been increased tremendously. But then the brick or the basic foundation of the CPCB was laid by the Water Act. So it represented India's first attempts to comprehensively deal with pollution, water pollution issues. And it create also ended up creating an institutional setup. Which institutional setup? The CPCB. So here it vests regulatory authorities in the State Pollution Control Board, which is basically in charge of the pollution and at the states, and which is also in charge of monitoring the level of effluents discharged into the various states, etc. Okay, so it empowers these boards to establish and enforce the standards. Yesterday we talked about the fact in Air Act also, that later on when the Air Act was passed in 1981, that provided a kind of a provision for the State Pollution Control Board and the CPCB to establish an emission norm. Here also effluents, the effluents which are discharged by the industries, what can be there or what should be the standard and the condition of those effluents, those have been established by the Water Act. So CPCB was established. Then it empowers the board to ensure compliance. Okay, by including what? So how will the board be able to ensure compliance? By giving them the power of entry, the power of examination, the power of searches. So power of entry for examination, testing of equipments, and power to take sample for the purpose of analysis. Okay, so with that they get a kind of a power which is vested in them to ensure that the effluent standards or the effluent level is not very contaminated. Now here the board also may close a defaulting industrial plant. Okay, and withdraw, and it can have a pecuniary action, is or pecuniary action is the financial action, but other than that it can also withdraw the supply of infrastructure, power of water by an offer, administrative order. So this is basically the aspect of the Water Act. Now let us take a look and let us have an appreciation for that matter for how fast the government agencies work and how quick the decision making in the government bodies happen. So basically, when we talk about the government initiatives to clean the river water in specific quantities, so it all started with the cleaning of River Ganga, because by the 70s, by the late 60s itself and the 70s itself, River Ganga sadly had gained a fame. Now, River Ganga is one of those rivers which supports one of the largest population densities across the globe. No other river will you find where you will find that across that large distance so many people are dependent on that river, and that river is also venerated and worshipped by such a large section of population in across the country, across the world as well. And this has been done historically as well, right? Even if you take a look at the ancient history or medieval history or the modern part of history, you will find that from all various areas the people would actually visit River Ganga in order to have that kind of a cultural connect, that kind of a religious aspect and veneration. So that has been done for a long period of time. Now, sadly, through the 60s, the 70s, the river had gained a fame and name across the world for being one of the most polluted rivers. It was not very polluted. You had certain rivers across the world which were much more polluted than River Ganga. For example, many rivers of China, they were polluted to a level which was even not comparable to River Ganga. And even, for example, when you take a look at Singapore, Singapore presently holds that baton for being very clean, but that had not always been the case. Now, here, that is why the government initially thought about it. And in the late 70s and the early 80s, I want you to understand the backdrop of it, under which these legislations, these rules, the Ganga Action Plan, etc., were being brought about. So at that point of time, while the country was not significantly industrialized, you did not have many of the industries. So closure of industries was never an option. Even today in our country, closure of industry is something which is not an option because we have very less industries anyways. So at that point of time, open defecation and sewage and fecal matter moving into the river, that was a point of significant concern. And that was a point of which was understood, which was carrying out significant amount of prolonged level of pollution in the river. So that is when the government launched the Ganga Action Plan in 1986 to clean the river. Along with that Ganga Action Plan, here you also had the government launching another program, that was Total Sanitation Campaign. Total Sanitation Campaign. Now, this was to create a kind of an open defecation free regions so that there would be enough amount of toilets. This was also launched way back in 1986. This program runs till today, almost 40 years later. But then its name has changed. And I'm sure we would be aware of about the change name. What is the change name of this particular program? It has gone through multiple different changes in various different decades. And this program presently is referred to as, yes, no, Avni, you are correct. That has changed into Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. So think about it, that this program is something about creation of open defecation free regions across the country. It is something which the governments of the day, and see, it is very easy to and point finger at a particular political party, political leader. That is always going to be very easy to do. But you have to understand that the crux of a government scheme lies in its implementation. And who is responsible for the implementation? The bureaucrats, the administrators, the the administrators at the district level, the administrators at the national level. And when you would be basically even in the foundation course for the entirety of the aspect of when you train to become an IAS, IPS, or IFS officers, when you go to the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy in Missouri. So there in the foundation course itself, you are basically filled with that kind of information that you are going to be responsible for the execution of all the programs, all the schemes, etc. So it is that particular scheme or the program which has been running for almost 40 years now. And now we have come to a stage where certain areas can claim that, yes, we are open defecation free. So that is why we always have to understand that there has to be a sense of appreciation, not for any particular person or an individual, but for what as a society we are moving towards. And that incredible rate of change, that needs to be appreciated, that needs to be celebrated, because believe it or not, as a member of a particular society, we are very, very stubborn. If the government today comes out with an order that nobody has to defecate near the river, trust me, all the people will go near the river to see that what happens. Not because they want to violate that order, just because of the thrill that it gives. That, okay, let's see whether we get caught or not. The government has issued the order. So we are not the greatest of the rule followers across the globe. So if you take a look at the cleaning of the region of Singapore, now, the amount of penalties that Singapore actually imposes on any individual carrying out any kind of waste dumping anywhere, that is much larger than even the monthly salaries, the average monthly salaries that people earn. In many of the cases, even more than the annual salaries that they earn. And that is also met by imprisonment. Imagine if that kind of a law or regulation would be passed in our country. Imagine what would have happened. So that is where this program of Ganga Action Plan simultaneously was launched along with the total sanitation campaign in order to understand, or in order to rid the river of that fecal matter or that sewage. Now, here in 1991, in this Ganga Action Plan, the tributaries were also included: Yamuna, Gomti, and Damodar. Why? Because it was understood that eventually these tributaries, they drain their water into river Ganga. So if the tributaries are dirty, how can the Ganga be clean? But here you can also have that particular kind of a thought process now, that it took the government a good 5-year time a good 5 year time and a good 5 year time interval to realize that, okay, if we want to clean the river Ganga, we need to clean the tributaries itself. This should have been a kind of an approach from day zero. That how is it that we achieve a cleaner river Ganga? That could only be achieved by the cleaner tributaries and the cleaner setup entirely. But it took a good span of time for them to realize that. Now, when we talk about these particular tributaries, Yamuna is one of those river which drains through the region of Delhi. So it has a lot of industrial and agricultural waste and agricultural waste and also untreated sewage. Now, Gomti, which major city lies on the banks of river Gomti? Are we aware of that? Which major city lies on the banks of river? Oh, very good. It is Lucknow. Lucknow lies on the banks of river Gomti. So Gomti also has been cleaned in the past 15 years, and various different state governments have played their own role into that when it comes to the beautification of the Gomti riverfront, etc. But Gomti at one point of time was so very polluted that, and those of you who live in Lucknow would adhere to the fact that even coming closer to that river would be a pain. Just like coming closer to river Yamuna is enough to give you nightmares in terms of the foul stench that it emits majority of the days. So Gomti also had a kind of a similar aspect. Now this would also carry all these kinds of waste. And Damodar we have already talked about. It was majorly industrial and mining waste. Industrial and mining waste which was generated. Okay. Now, then in 1995, again after 4 years, National River Conservation Plan was launched, where there was a kind of an overarching ambition to create a kind of a entirety of the conservation of the river, maintaining the flow of the river, everything needed to be done. And that was done in 1995. Now, for your examination purposes, you have to understand the aspect or the chronology of it. As the very famous quotation goes, that chronology is important. So, chronology is something that you need to understand here. The National Ganga River Basin Authority was constituted under the Environment Act 1986 in 2009 to strengthen the National River Conservation Plan. So this was the National Ganga River Basin Authority. This is a statutory body. This was a statutory body. Okay, this is relevant for your prelims. That under what act was it established? You can always expect a statement based question here. Then in 2011, you had the National Mission for Clean Ganga. That was established in 2011. Now, here, when we take a look at the objectives of the National Mission of Clean Ganga, that is something I want you to analyze. Obviously, you won't be able to learn everything by heart. So, always try to have a kind of a trend analysis where you analyze what are the larger trends of the objectives and you are able to recreate on your own when the time comes. So, this mission incorporates rehabilitation and boosting the existing STPs, sewage treatment plants. Okay. So once you are able to manufacture, or rather make and construct significant number of sewage treatment plants, obviously the fecal matter and the sewage that is discharged, that will be taken care of. Okay. Then curb pollution at exit points on the river front in order to check inflow of sewage. Okay. Then continuity of water flow without the natural variations of the seasons. So water flow. What is also referred to as the ecological flow or E flow. ecological flow. Now, what is the importance of maintaining the ecological flow? Because when we talk about the flowing water, the fresh water, now the reason why it is able to maintain a kind of a biodiversity or an ecosystem purity is because it is flowing. Now, in many of the regions, you would also have experienced, as many of you have recounted in the comment section as well, that the flow is disturbed. Why? The flow is significantly disturbed because of dumping of waste. Significant amount of waste are dumped into the river channel itself, and that causes a lot of natural disasters as well. What we saw unfold in Himachal around a couple of weeks back, one of the major causes for that disaster has been a kind of a endless amount of dumping of waste into the river, because our tendency is something which is something that I don't need to tell you, you don't need to tell anyone, but something that you would observe in your surrounding as well. As long as the waste that I have, even if I throw it in my neighbor's house, I don't care for it. Now it is no longer my problem. Now it is the problem of the neighbor. Or if I throw the waste on the road, it is the government's problem. Now it is not my problem anymore. So people have that tendency to dump a lot of waste, construction material, construction debris. When nobody is looking, let us dump it into the river and be done with it. The nature will take care of it. If the nature creates a disaster, then the government is responsible. So that is where the ecological flow is damaged. When the flow of the river is damaged, water stays in the same region for a longer duration. That impacts the availability of dissolved oxygen, because in the case of the river flow, it is during that flow that in that flow you have the air water interchange, and the water gets significant amount of oxygen as well. But also the various species are adapted to that flow being maintained. If the flow is not maintained, you are creating a kind of a static system which is not conducive for the availability of enough food sources for various species such as Gangetic river dolphins. Okay, so and that flow also will naturally cater to many of the pollutants naturally being discharged. But if that flow is not maintained, it creates a lot of issues. Then, so to maintain and restore the surface flow and groundwater, then to regenerate and maintain the natural vegetation of the area. Of which area? Of the region around the river bank, of the region in the floodplains. Why? Why natural vegetation is required? So that it filters out the waste. It traps the heavy contaminants, doesn't allow it to go into the river. Okay, to conserve and regenerate the aquatic biodiversity as well as the riparian biodiversity, that is which is present in the floodplain. Riparian biodiversity that exists across the floodplain, across the marshes of the river. And another one which was significant, which has not been done so significantly, is participation of public in the process of protection. Any government scheme, and you can write it in your answer as well, in your interview panel as well, that any government scheme, the success of it hinges completely on the public participation. For example, even when we talk about solid waste dumping, the government can bring all the various legislations that it wants. Any legislation that you can recommend, the government can bring. But if the public participation is not there, that scheme will never work. The ideal example is that of, if I diverge a bit here, the ideal example is that of the Motor Vehicles Act. Now, Motor Vehicles Act is something that you would observe, or if you recall, I don't know how many of you recall, but when the Motor Vehicles Act was passed around 5 years back, the new Motor Vehicles Act, which imposed very heavy penalties for people who would not wear helmets, for people who did not have the driver's license, for people who basically violated the traffic rules. Now, why was it done? To reduce the number of road accidents that we have in our country, because India alone has one of the maximum number of road deaths in the world. And unless and until it happens, God forbid that it happens, but unless and until it happens in someone's close vicinity and close near and dear ones, we largely pay heed to any of the road or the traffic regulations. People take a particular amount of pride in violating those traffic regulations, right? Now, once that was passed, you would have seen that a lot of public anger was created. Public was largely against that. That why should you fine if I'm not wearing the helmet? My hairdo is something which is impacted. Why, if I'm going only for 5 kilometers, do I need to wear helmets? Now, what has happened? That act, despite of its stringent measures, is not a success. People still are not following the traffic norms. Why? Because the public participation is not there. Similarly, in the case of open defecation, now you have created provisions for the construction of toilets in order to cater to open defecation. Various different districts, various different state governments, they are struggling incredibly hard to create an open defecation free environment. But if the larger public participation is not there, if the public is not ready to use that toilet, what will you do? Will you have your police force deployed for this process? And would the work of the police force would be to catch those people in the early morning who are carrying out open defecation? Can the state or the nation work in this way? Absolutely not. So that is where public participation, if it is not there, regardless of the rules, regardless of the legislation that you bring in, regardless of whichever individual you bring to power, that will never be a success. So that is what you have to suggest in every policy measure that you are, not only for environment ecology, even in the paper 2 of GS for the governance, even there you can highlight the role of public participation. Okay. Then after that, you had the establishment of National Ganga Council, which was done in 2016. Now, this was done in order to have a sharpened approach and a kind of a mission mode approach for cleaning the river Ganga. But here, observe the similarities. And here you have to observe the similarities from the National Mission for Clean Ganga. Observe that. So this was basically National Council for Rejuvenation, Protection and Management of River Ganga. That was its entirety of the full form. Now it was formed as per the order of 2016. It dissolved the National Ganga River Basin Authority and replaced it with the National Ganga Council, and its overall role was to prevent the pollution and to provide a kind of a fresh flow, rejuvenate the flow of river Ganga, which has been inhibited quite significantly for the various aspects of pollution, etc. So its jurisdiction extends to the various different states in which not only the river Ganga but also its tributaries, they do exist and contribute to the water in river Ganga. Now here, take a look at it. So, the chief function of the council is the implementation of the National Mission for Clean Ganga, and what is also the Namami Gange program. So here, what are the objectives? So when we take a look at it, I want you to observe that. So here the objectives are almost similar. So this is the National Mission for Clean Ganga. So that is about the boosting of the STPs, instant steps to curb pollution, etc. So this is the National Mission for Clean Ganga and the objectives thereby natural vegetation, riparian biodiversity. Now, this National Mission for Clean Ganga will comply with the directions and the decisions of the National Ganga Council. Which council? National Ganga Council. Ganga Council. Okay. And then after that, if you take a look at it, all these will be carried out by the National Ganga Council. Now, what was the National Ganga River Basin Authority? That has been replaced by the National Ganga Council overall. So these are the steps taken to curb the pollution in river Ganga. Okay. Any doubts that prevail till now? Any doubts that exist till now? Good. So now we come to the portion of marine pollution. So marine pollution is what? We have mostly north rivers or rivers in south well managed. No, Saurabh. it is not as if there is a difference in management of the rivers as compared to North India and South India, even though that is a perception which does exist. But you have to understand that wherever the population density is higher, there will be pollution. The population density, as it keeps on increasing even in the region of the southern states, and it is increasing, there is no denying the fact, there will be greater amount of discharge of sewage, industrial waste, municipal solid waste, all of them which will happen. Take the case of river Godavari. Take the case of river Kaveri. River Kaveri at one point of time was very famed for the cleaner waters that it had. Historically, if you observe the literature of the region, there has always been a celebration of the purity of river Kaveri. But look at the water of river Kaveri now. Many of the regions, the flow has been reduced due to over extraction and due to the stoppage of the flow, and the river will give you an appearance of incredible amount of pollution because of large settlements which have happened. Ask any of your friends or colleagues who have been living across the banks of river Kaveri or whose native place lies in these regions. They will adhere to the fact, and if you ask the elders, they will always adhere to the fact that how Kaveri water has been changing its basic properties over the past few decades, and that is because of the population pressure. So population pressure, if it is not managed particularly well, it will cause issues. Earlier, Godavari never used to flood that much. But if you follow the news headlines for the past 4 to 5 years, Godavari always ends up getting flooded in these months. Even right now, in these months, you would have observed that river Godavari, river Narmada, they are basically on the verge of getting flooded. Why? Because on the river channel we have managed to dump the waste, we have reduced the flow of in the river channel itself, so all the water will start flooding, over flooding and overflowing. So that is why it is a diversified issue. Then comes the portion of marine pollution. Marine pollution is a kind of pollution that you observe or that you witness in the case of the sea areas or the coastal areas. That is what is regarded as marine pollution. Okay, this is carried out in the water bodies, seas and the oceans of the world. Now here, if you take a look at it, the definition of it is something which is always, I maintain that definitions are very complex and complicated. So if you want to confuse yourself for any particular topic, start studying the definition, you will definitely get confused. But nonetheless, what is the definition of it? The introduction by man, directly or indirectly, of substances or energy to the marine environment, resulting in deleterious effects such as hazards to human health, hindrance to marine activities, impairment of quality of seawater for various uses, and reduction of amenities. That is regarded as marine pollution. Or, in simple words, pollution of the sea and the oceanic water which damages the aquatic or the marine ecosystem, that is marine pollution. Whichever portion you find easier to express, use that. Okay, now the types of marine pollution which are created or caused. One is eutrophication. We have studied eutrophication, that is overloading of, mainly, eutrophication in the case of the marine areas is observed in the coastal waters, across the coastline, the coastal seas. Overloading of the coastal marine waters with nutrients. So everywhere in the coastline, it is the coastline. As we move into the portion further, I'll also talk about which are these areas which are polluted. So you will observe that majority of the coastal areas and the coastline, they end up being witness to maximum amount of pollution which is caused. Then you have ocean acidification. That is also a kind of a marine pollution. Now this happens when the oceanic water starts turning acidic, and we will study about it in greater detail in the next module of climate change. But this is when, due to increase in CO2 levels in water, the marine regions turn acidic. Okay. Then toxins are basically discharged as a result of industrial waste as well as shipping and transportation industry. Okay. In the shipping and transportation industry also, there is a release of significant amount of toxins in the process. Then, because whenever you have the solid waste dumping by the shipping industry, nowadays shipping industry is still being held accountable. But if you take a look even 4 years back or 5 years back or 10 years back, shipping industry would carry out the dumping of the waste in the open ocean and seas with quite a significant amount of alacrity, with a lack of accountability whatsoever. So that is why the marine dumping of the toxins is one of the major problems. Then plastic, coastal waste dumping, coastal waste dumping, and also transportation industry. Okay. Then you have the underwater noise. So underwater noise is created by what? For example, you have the drilling platforms, oil extraction platforms. Then, for example, you have the submarines, the ships. They create significant amount of underwater noise. But you will never hear a kind of a large public complaint against the underwater noise, especially by the oil companies. Oil companies never let these kinds of complaints emerge outside, even by the activist groups or the climate groups. It was a kind of a research which was later on publicized, where even organizations that we hold in highest regard, such as many of the good organizations which we think they are responsible for climate conservation and conservation of the environment, many of them had their donors from the oil industry. So if an oil industry is donating to some or giving me some money, I have my income coming from the oil industry, why will I ever complain against the oil industry? So oil drilling platforms are one of the larger emitters of the underwater noise. So this is drilling platforms, ships, and submarines. Okay, so that is basically what ends up creating that underwater noise. Then we come to the portion of Great Pacific Garbage Patch. We'll take a look at it. Before that, we take a 12 minutes break, 12, 13 minutes break, and we'll be back. And then we'll talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, what it is, where it is created. Okay, so let's take a break and let's be back. A confirmation about the audio, please, guys, if the audio is available. Thank you. So now we talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So basically, when we talk about the coastal dumping of the waste, now that coastal dumping of the waste is something which has been carried out incessantly and in an unsustainable manner across the entirety of the world almost. Now, when we dump the waste across the coastline by the industries, by even the municipal corporations, etc., the larger point of view is that, okay, this waste which is dumped will automatically be taken care of by the nature itself. But because of the various different circulations which happen in the oceans, including the presence of the ocean currents and the presence of the gyre formation in the oceans, that ends up creating larger patches, very large patches where this garbage tends to accumulate, right? And it is basically carried out. So even if, let's say, you have a coastal dumping here or coastal dumping here across the eastern or the western Pacific, aided by the ocean currents, and ocean currents play a very important and pertinent role in ensuring the circulation of the waste and accumulation of the waste in a particular area in any particular region. So that garbage patch is created, and that is a very large garbage patch which is, and just to give you an idea about it, the garbage patch which has been created over the region of the Pacific, in now significant portions of them are being cleaned by the various different NGOs, by the various different partner organizations. But then the territorial area, the size of it, is something which is almost twice the size of the territory of Spain. So you can think about the pertinent issue which confronts us. You can think about the enormity of the situation which confronts us. So all that garbage which tends to accumulate, that garbage has got a significant amount of issue and significant amount of a long-term damage created in the marine ecosystem. How? So when we talk about the marine dumping, marine garbage patches, okay. Now here, one of the key things that you will find at play is basically plastic waste. Now, owing to the salinity of the oceanic water and also owing to the various different, for example, even the temperature conditions, the hotter conditions, etc., the plastics, they get disintegrated into microbeads. Plastics get deformed or disintegrated into smaller parts, what we refer to as microbeads. And these microbeads enter the food chain by the process of biomagnification and bioaccumulation. And also, you'll find these enter into the respiratory tracts. Okay. So that is where they are able to create a significant amount of disaster and a large amount of havoc into the aquatic ecosystem. But along with that, due to blocking of sunlight and nutrient flow, block sunlight and nutrient flow, due to this, they end up creating dead zones or hypoxic water condition. Even the plankton growth is inhibited in many of the areas, and we do know that planktons, they form the base or the basis of the marine food chain. Now, dead zone is basically a common term for hypoxia, which basically means that you have a very reduced level of dissolved oxygen in the water. And that amount of dissolved oxygen in the water, that is very important for ensuring respiration for the marine species. So if the quantity of dissolved oxygen gets abysmally low or significantly low, it will have a long term impact. So you have areas with low oxygen conditions, they have the dissolved oxygen concentration of just 2 milligram per liter or less. When these conditions prevail, that is when water is referred as hypoxic. Hypoxic. Okay, that is when we have the water being referred to as hypoxic. So this is the kind of image for the various different areas where the hypoxic waters are prevalent, where you have a significant amount of contamination and the amount of dissolved oxygen is very less. And amongst them, you will find or you will observe that you have significant portions in the coastal areas. Look at the coastlines in the region of the Western Europe, northern part of Europe, etc. Look at these coastlines. In India, in comparison, we don't have that much amount of pollution which is created in the coastline because obviously the amount of industrialization is comparatively lesser. But wherever the amount of industrialization is significantly larger, observe the creation of these dead zones. For example, recently, I'm sure many of you would have, when you are covering the portion of current affairs, most of you would have covered the portion that Japan had taken a decision to release the water that had been trapped during the Fukushima nuclear disaster into the water again. Right? Have you heard about that? Or are we not aware about that particular portion of current affairs? No? Okay. So basically, I'm sure you would be aware of the fact that Japan suffered from a large nuclear disaster during the time when Japan experienced a tsunami. That was the Fukushima nuclear disaster, where there was leakage of nuclear materials and nuclear substances into the surrounding regions. Now, all that wastewater was capped and was stored. Now, over a period of time, it is said that they have treated significant amount of it. They have treated significant portions of it. They have gotten rid of the radioactive waste, but still you can never get rid of the entirety of the radioactive waste. And recently, Japan has basically, after almost more than a decade, Japan has taken a decision to discharge that kind of Fukushima water again back into the sea, due to which various different countries have indicated their policy decision where they have said that we are not going to have any more fish imports from the region of Japan, because once you discharge that radioactive water into the sea, that means that radioactive components or the radioactive contaminants will directly or indirectly enter into the marine food chain. And once it enters the food chain, so all the people who will be consuming the fishes uh, captured from that area, they will also have some amount of that contamination as well. So that is how the marine wastes, they end up creating these hypoxic waters. So this is always aided by the ocean currents as well and the ocean circulation as well. Okay, now this is basically about the creation of the dead zones. Is it actually, if it is many decades, it has not been many, it has been around a decade and a half. So when is it that the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened? Are we aware of the Fukushima nuclear disaster when it happened? So it happened around 2011. So it has only been around a decade, right? So in that aspect, a decade is not considered to be enough to get rid of all the various different contaminants which have accumulated over a period of time. Okay. So now we come to a portion which almost all of us are very familiar with in our day-to-day lives, and that is the aspect of land pollution. So when we talk about land pollution, in simple terms, it is the pollution of the land, where the land that we live on, that gets polluted by the toxins and the contaminants. Now, this land pollution can be classified, categorized into two types. You have the soil pollution and what is regarded as the complete land pollution. So, if I talk about soil pollution, and here the name in itself is self explanatory, and land pollution, what do you think would be the difference in between these? The difference between the land pollution and soil pollution. What do you think would be the difference here? Any of us? Take a random guess based upon the aspect of what is given in the term itself. See, many of the times you will have to, and based upon the changing pattern of civil services, you need to take care of these particular differentiation. Soil would affect agriculture. No, I'm talking about the basic difference between soil and land pollution. Saurabh, surface soil and land beneath. Okay, good. Land will affect the available area. Okay, both are not same. No, both are not same. Saurabh is correct here. Okay. And see, this is where you have to apply your logic, guys, because in prelims, the changing pattern is such whereby you have to understand that many of the terminologies will be absolutely new to you. So you have to apply your logic and not panic at that point of time. The people who are succeeding in prelims right now are only those who are able to solve those questions and queries at the get go. So please start applying your mind as much as possible. Don't depend upon the fact that, okay, I have studied this, so question will come only from this area. Sridevi, perfect. What you have given is perfect answer, that in the case of the soil pollution, only the surface gets polluted. In the case of the land pollution, the level of pollution or the contamination percolates even in the lower region. So here, soil pollution impacts only the surface. Okay. And when we talk about land pollution, here, contamination is observed even in lower layers. Okay. Now, here, let us take a look at it. So basically, the definition of it, that physical or chemical alteration to land causing the land use change. How the land, basically earlier it would have been a region where you would have some plants, some amount of ecosystem services being carried on, but now that has changed into or converted into a kind of a dump yard. So it is an addition of foreign elements to such an extent that it can no longer sustain the ecosystem that depended upon it. It is mainly caused due to dumping and improper disposal of industrial and domestic waste, along with semi solid waste resulting from agriculture. So, there are multiple reasons or the multiple causes due to which the soil and land pollution happens. Land pollution, degradation of the earth's land surfaces both above and below the ground level. Whereas soil pollution, pollution of the topmost layer of the earth or contamination of soil with significantly larger concentration of toxic substances. So this is restricted to the surface. Restricted to the surface itself. Okay. Now, what are the various causes of land or the soil pollution? First of all, agricultural activities. Now, agricultural activities, they form a major cause for this land or soil pollution, because when these agricultural activities are carried out, as we have discussed numerous times earlier as well, that you end up using significant amount of chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, all of them are used in larger quantums and larger sums. So usage of pesticides, fertilizers, etc., herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, all of them that you use in order to take care of the various infections of the plants. Now, these include heavy contaminants, right? These include significant amount of heavy contaminants. Now, after this is basically something that all of us would have witnessed, or all of us are aware of, that once these contaminants, they are basically sprayed while they take care of the diseases of the plants, but all these contaminants, they start spreading up over the region of the land. Now, in case you carry out significant amount of irrigation as well, now then these contaminants, they will percolate to the lower regions, and they can end up contaminating the bottom portion of the land and can end up contaminating the groundwater as well. Then we have other cause as the mining and extraction activities. So here, movement of rocks due to mining activities and overburden in case of surface mining can result in erosion, sinkholes, loss of biodiversity, or even the contamination of soil. So which are the metals which are associated with the mining and process and the contamination? Mercury, arsenic, lead, antimony, cadmium. As I told you, all of the heavy contaminants, and these are the minerals that you find associated with the rock formation itself. These are trapped within the rock formations itself. It is during the process of mining and extraction where all of this, they get accumulated and they remain on top of this. That is why all of you, or any of you who belong from the mining towns of the country, the mining regions of the country, you would associate with the fact that how these particular activities of mining, etc., they have created a larger areas of non-productive regions, where even if the mining is no longer carried out in that region, but you have such amount of coal dust, iron ore dust, which has been deposited over the land, that there is no further growth of plants. So this creates mining activities or mining outcomes. They create larger zones of non-productivity. Okay. Also contaminate the soil for a longer term. These toxins can be taken in by the plants when agriculture is carried out in the future. In future. Okay, they can be taken in by the plants when agriculture is carried out in the future, and toxins move through the food chain. Okay. Now, after that, we also have the rapid urbanization. The rate of urbanization in India across the globe, that is consistently increasing. Now, when the urbanization is increasing, that means you have larger number of people who are migrating to the urban areas, isn't it? So there is an increase in the number of cities, the population, and industrialization, which impacts the ecosystems. And this also involves migrations or migrant settlements. And whenever the migrant settlements happen, proper waste disposal and sanitation is not followed. And when this is not followed, you have dumping of solid waste and toxic wastewater. Reduces the productivity of a region for a longer time. Okay, they will reduce the productivity of a region for a longer period of time as well. So here, excessive consumption of plastic bags, they end up accumulating in the soil and prevents the germination of the seed. So even where you have these toxins, let's say where the dumping has been cleared, does not mean immediately the land or the ground will return back to normalcy. In all these areas, these toxins, they penetrate the soil for such a long period of time and for such a great amount of concentration that these regions will not be able to support biodiversity for many years to come, in certain cases for many decades to follow as well. Now, when we talk about the solid waste in India, quantity of solid waste generated is close to around 1.5 lakh tons per day. Now, this is just an indicative figure. Now, for this particular figure, I would always suggest to you that when you are appearing for the mains examination, immediately before that, whichever year you are appearing for the mains examination, kindly revise this particular data from the site of the ministry itself. This is just to show you a kind of an indicative picture. Now, here the efficiency of waste collection is only around 97%. That is almost 3% of the waste is not even collected. So, when I say that 3% of the waste is not collected, think about it. 3% means close to around 5 lakh tons of waste per day is not even collected. That means close to 5 lakh tons of waste, eh, or rather tons per day of waste is not collected. Okay. Then 47% of the waste is treated and 26% of the waste almost remains unaccounted for. So that is the condition. Excuse me. Now, here, India is the third largest generator of the solid waste in the world, but as and when the population and as and when the amount of industrialization, urbanization is increasing, we are going to cross that figure very soon. So, the waste which is generated, the solid waste which is generated can be classified into municipal waste, industrial or hazardous waste, and even biomedical waste. Now, here you will observe this is a kind of a depiction of solid waste generation per capita. That is the total amount of waste generated per capita. So you would observe that while in 2016-17 this figure was around 132.78, this has reduced to 121.54 in 2018-19, has reduced to 119.26 in 2019-20. Now, why do you think that the waste generated per capita has been reducing? Is it because of better waste management practices? No. That is because the population is increasing. So when we talk about per capita, that is total waste generated by the population. So if the population keeps on increasing, the waste generated per capita, that in number will always indicate a continuous or a gradual decline overall. Then, what is municipal solid waste or municipal waste in general? Which is consisting of the household waste, which consists of, let's say, when we talk about the waste generated, even when we talk about construction activities, so household waste, construction and demolition debris, the sanitation waste, waste from streets, the waste that we see or we encounter on a day to day basis, that is regarded as the municipal waste. Okay, that is something that we encounter almost on a day to day basis. It comprises of both solid and liquid waste. Now, when it is dumped over a particular region, wherever you end up dumping the municipal waste, and there, from these dump yards and these dump sites, you have the release of harmful gases, gases that we have talked about yesterday, that is methane, hydrogen sulfide, etc. And toxins, they are released on the ground surface as well. Now, this can again be divided into biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste. But the problem is we do not segregate that waste. This is a kind of an image that most of us are familiar with, where there is no segregation, whether it is a solid waste, whether it is a liquid waste, whether it is a biodegradable waste, whether it is a non-biodegradable waste, whether it is a medical waste, any kind of waste. What do? In majority of the households, we wrap it in a plastic sheet, we throw it up, and then it is the work of the nature and work of the government to take care of that particular waste. Why? Because that is how it is. So that is where the crux of the problem lies. So here, municipal areas of the country, they generate 1,33,000 metric tons per day of municipal solid waste, of which only 91,000 tons per day is collected and 25,000 is treated. 25,000 tons is treated. So you can imagine the enormity of the situation by understanding that what a huge amount of waste goes untreated. Okay, and here when we talk about industrial waste, so that is where this is characterized or carried out by the industrial process. The waste which is generated, the waste water which is generated, which includes all the heavy contaminants, fly ash, metallic residues, mercury, etc. Now if we talk about fly ash for a brief moment, fly ash is generated from where? Generated mostly from thermal, or rather coal based thermal power plants. Okay, now this fly ash contains contaminants like aluminum silicates, mercury, etc. So it is very, very harmful when that fly ash is dumped outside into the atmosphere without treated. Okay, many of the power plants, now you have the electrostatic precipitators and the ESPs which have been installed. But historically, many of the power plants had that kind of a tendency to directly emit that particular fly ash and that particular waste without treating it at all. So that is where you have the presence of this fly ash. Now, this can contaminate the water, this can contaminate the soil, and can have adverse impact in terms of the toxicity of even the crops if dumped in large quantities. In many of the areas, it would lead to the sudden death of the large number of crops as well. Because this fly ash, which is grayish in appearance, as you would have observed, now in the cases of these fly ash, many of the times that fly ash would get deposited on the leaves, on the various different leaf nodules, and they would cover the pores of the leaves, right? And then the leaf's ability or the plant's ability to carry out photosynthesis would be altered in a negative manner. Now, that is why the fly ash is now being used significantly in other productive areas, and the government has also mandated the use of fly ash in certain regions in particular. For example, where is it that this fly ash can be used? Can be used for what? Brick making, where the fly ash bricks are considered to be lighter and they are strong as well. So they can be an alternate to the bricks that we manufacture normally. And those bricks, the brick kilns, they are anyways a source of pollution. And these bricks, they are significantly stronger, lighter, and the earlier bricks, that the traditional bricks that we have, many of them, they are manufactured by the illegal sand mining mafias. So that is why this is much more eco-friendly as well. Then that can be used for construction of houses, pavements, etc. Now, when that brick is laid on the pavements, that provides for easy percolation of water as well. That ensures an aeration facility as well. And that is why in the regions close to the power plants, it has been mandated that any pavement work or construction work which is carried out needs to have the presence of that fly ash. Now, even when this fly ash, if it is used in very limited or trace quantities, in very small quantities, when you use that fly ash, let's say as an augmentation into the soil, you add that in very limited quantity, the soil nutrient can be enriched over a long run. So when added in very small quantity in a diluted form, it can increase the soil fertility in the long run, because it would end up adding significant amount of nutrients to the soil. So when added in very limited quantity, can add to the fertility of the soil in the long run. Okay. So the this is a typical idea or ideation of the industrial waste which is generated. Now, most of the industrial waste which is generated, so that largely is generated from the smaller industries, the industries which are functioning in the unorganized sector. Because when it comes to the organized sector, there is a significant understanding that in these organized sector or the large industries, the amount of scrutiny, the amount of regulation is very high. But in many different, any city that you consider, whichever city that you come from, you would also adhere to the fact that even you would not be aware that how many small and local scale industries they keep on operating, and what is the amount of waste that they discharge. So Basically, you had close to around in 2020 and 21, you had close to around 11 million metric tons of hazardous waste which are which have been generated. Okay, but most of this waste is actually utilizable. It is about utilizing that waste, developing a kind of a circular economy in that. So most of them are basically utilizable. Okay, and significant amount of them are recyclable as well. So if this waste, industrial waste, is treated properly, then not only will it in a way recharge the circular economy ecosystem, it will also end up providing for the cleaner environment. Then biomedical waste generated from the medical centers, generated from the hospitals, the private healthcare centers, the small primary healthcare centers. Now, they also generate very toxic waste. Now, that toxic waste is something which was very apparent during the time of the COVID pandemic, when you had infected waste, etc., which were dumped into the open. Now, that had a tendency to pollute the entire region and the entire ecosystem. So that is where the biomedical waste can be very dangerous over a period of time. So that is why for the treatment of biomedical waste, you have the color code pattern which is followed and the color codation which is done, where you would observe. And if you nowadays go to a kind of a any maintained even government hospital or even let's say a private medical facility, you would observe that there are different coloration of the bins or the garbage dumps. They have a different coloration pattern amongst them. You would notice that. So that is basically the segregation of the waste. So one of the key points of waste management is segregation of the waste. That segregation of the waste which needs to be done and then handled as per requirement. For example, you would have observed in these medical facilities that significant in smaller portions you have the white plastic containers which would include needles, cut glasses, etc., and they are basically buried in a sharp pit and taken into a common treatment facility sometimes. Then infected plastics such as syringes, gloves, and plastic waste, they are put into a blue plastic container. Now both of them, they are disinfected. After they have been used, there is a requirement for disinfectation of these in order to ensure that they are not a source for the hospital borne diseases, which is again a major cause of concern for the drug resistant microbes which are increasing in large proportion. Then you have the anatomical body waste as well. Now these are dumped into the yellow plastic container and they are taken for a very deep burial site. Then you have soiled waste such as the infected dressings, the POP casts when you have a fracture, etc. So all of that is put into a red plastic container and then they are put into the deep burial. Then you have non-infected waste as well, which is basically the drugs, the expired drugs, etc., the radioactive waste. Now they are treated chemically, and then after that, they are put into a secured landfill. So this is basically the treatment of the biomedical waste. But that biomedical waste, first of all, we need to ensure that we account for all the biomedical waste which is generated. That is where a major problem lies. That majority of that biomedical waste goes unaccounted for. Okay, not majority of them, but still a substantial amount of that biomedical waste that goes unaccounted for. So first of all, we need to track that all that waste is accounted for. We are collecting that at least. And once we are collecting that, in case any particular hospital or in case any medical facility is found to be violating that, stringent penalties to the point of closure of that medical facility should be carried out immediately by CPCB. So that is something as a way forward that you can provide. Then we talk about the plastic and the microplastic waste which is generated. So here The plastic waste or the plastic pollution is what accumulation of the plastic objects in the Earth's environment. And microplastics, these are the small pieces of plastic with a size of less than 5 millimeter in length that occur in the environment as a consequence of the plastic pollution. Now, in many of the cases, these plastic wastes are then put fire upon, they are burned, right? Majority of these plastic waste in India, they are to be done in the coastal areas and also, excuse me, also in the region of the floodplains of the river. So they contaminate the river water as well over a period of time, and also these release some toxins which percolate to the ground's surface. Plastic waste in India is increasing at an exponential rate, ever so slightly, and that is because the industrialization, industrial production, economic activities, as they are happening, the amount of plastic waste generated is also going to increase. India is the fifth highest generator of plastic waste across the entirety of the world. Okay. um, in Mumbai, Juhu Beach became like this. Yes. And that is where in Mumbai you also have the success story about the cleaning of the Versova Beach. And that Versova Beach cleaning, which has happened, has basically laid a kind of a guideline of how the entire cleaning can be carried out in many of the regions. But then the sad point is, we rely on some individual to clean the beach, and in the meanwhile, all the vendors, for example, that you find in the beaches, there the usage of plastic should absolutely be banned. Now, the same individuals, the same set of people who throw plastic almost irresponsibly in the beaches, if they take a trip abroad, there you will find that they are very spick and span, clean and maintained. But when it comes to India, that is where they feel that it is the right, the fundamental right, and this is a right to pollute. And that is, once they are polluting, then it is the role of the government, right? So then we come to the portion of e waste. What is e waste? Electrical and electronic waste. That is regarded as e-waste. Now, this is becoming one of the major headaches for a developing country like India, and also for the developed part of the world also. This is adding to the woes significantly. Now, what is this e-waste basically? Electrical and electronic equipment, whole or in part discarded as a waste. What is the difference between electrical and electronic equipment? In Australia, they use net to clean river and they get more profit. It's workable. Yes, it is. But then obviously you have to understand that this will work only in the case of solid waste. What about the liquid waste contamination? The liquid waste contamination which is happening in the river, that is something which you cannot clean overall. Right? Now, what is the difference between electric and electronic waste, or the electric and electronic equipments? Electronic uses electricity to function. Electrical also uses electricity to function. Wiring and silicon. Okay. So the basic difference is in terms of the operation. So electrical devices, they always will operate at larger voltages. They will always operate at larger currents. Whereas electronic devices, they operate at small, you will find millivolt, milliampere, right? That is the electronic devices. Electrical devices will always end up operating in volts, amperes, that is the of wattages. So that is the functionality and the difference between them, the basic difference that you should be aware of. Now, these e-wastes are generated by the households, by the bulk consumers, by the industries as well. Now, in our country, and as is the case with the most of the developing part of the world, the problem lies is we don't know what to do with that e-waste. For majority of us, that e-waste keeps on getting accumulated. For example, many of you would still uh, be adhering to the fact or will acknowledge the fact that in many of your households, you would still have the older mobile phones that you might not have used ever since. But you have not thrown that mobile phone or you have not thrown that electronic gadget. Because for many of us, these electronic items are such a prized possession that we don't know what to do with it. even if it is of no use, we store it somewhere, that some fine day when the apocalypse comes, maybe I will take out that 10-year-old phone and start work. But that never happens, right? And also, there is not a proper mechanism how to handle those wastes. If I want to dispose of the electronic gadgets, where will I dispose? We don't have that mechanism. So that is why this e-waste basically keeps on piling up. It keeps on piling up in the industries, it keeps on piling up in the households, never to be utilized again. Now, these electronic waste, they consist of various different important components which can be recycled, which can be extracted and can be reused. For example, suppose when we talk about any electronic item, it will have intricate wiring within the printed circuit boards, which are done by, let's say, a silver lining or a gold plating. So these are very precious elements, right? Even though they are present in very small quantities, does not mean that you immediately crack open your parents' phone and you start that I want to extract gold out of it. That is not how much gold is present. It is present in very trace quantities, and you need special chemical solutions in order to extract that. So even though it is present in very small quantities, but nonetheless it is a kind of a value based economic system. Countries like China, they have established an entire ecosystem for the extraction of these precious elements from these e-waste, and large factories have been set up. Now, once you start extracting these e-waste or the precious items in these e-waste, they can be reused again. They can be reused in the newer gadget manufacturing. And what will it lead to? Reduction in the prices of the newer gadgets. So the newer gadgets will start becoming cheaper as well. So that is the establishment of the circular economy overall, where we reuse, recycle, and reduce the waste which is generated. So that is where you establish a kind of a circular system of economy. So e-waste is a source of toxic and hazardous pollutants, including the PVC, lead, mercury, and etc. So in India, India generated around 3.2 million metric tons of e-waste in 2019. However, that 2019 figure is not important. What is important is to understand that in the next few decades, our e-waste generation is going to increase by a whopping 40 times. So the amount of e-waste generated would increase by a whopping 40 times. Okay. 95% of e-waste in India is recycled by the informal or the unorganized sector and the scrap dealers that you have. Now, in the informal sector, you don't have a proper standard operating procedure. You don't have a proper mechanization of how to handle these waste. So, in due to this, what happens is significant wastage of materials. Okay. Other than that, what are the other issues? Significant wastage of materials. Then, other than that, greater amount of pollution. Of pollution. Here, all kinds of pollution are caused because many of the waste that you cannot treat, you don't have the technology or capability to treat, you will simply burn it off or you will dump it into the ground. So, land pollution, water pollution, all of them, air pollution by burning, all of them can be created. And then, health hazards for the workers. Why? Because when we talk about the health hazard for workers, many of the workers in this unorganized sector, almost in all the workers in the unorganized sector, none of them will follow the proper safety equipment and proper gear, protection equipment in order to carry out that recycling. That is not the priority ever. That is not the priority at all. So when you have these heavy contaminants, for example, PVC, etc., now they are grinded openly and you have this silica dust which keeps on flying. And that is where you have the diseases, onset of diseases such as lung infections, such as even silicosis. So you have diseases such as silicosis. Okay, so that is also caused in the process. So here you would see that the projected e-waste generation in our country is supposed to increase by almost a whopping 40 times with the rising population, with the increased adaptation of electronic gadgets, because we have a very youthful demography, we have a very young population. And when you have a young population which is present, that means there is a greater adoption of these e-waste or electronic items, and more of them will get dumped as well, as technology gets changed every year. Almost every 6 to 8 months the technology in itself changes. So that is when you will have the requirement of the newer items as well, the newer prospects as well. Now we take a look at the impact or the effects of land pollution, and then we will talk about how to treat them and the legislations which have been brought, the amendments which have been brought for the process. So when we talk about the effects of land pollution in agriculture, what happens when the land gets contaminated? Its productivity over the long run reduces. So it reduces the nitrogen fixation. Why? Because pollution impacts the presence and availability of microbes into the soil, including the soil microbes, the natural microbes which are found in the soil, which will carry out the decomposition and the degradation processes as well. The number of microbes which you find in the soil, that reduces. Over a period of time, it would also end up impacting the fertility of the soil, right? By reducing the organic content of the soil. Okay, then the pesticides, over application of the fertilizers. We have already seen, and all of us who have attended the portion of geography, you would adhere to the fact that when you over apply the fertilizers, pesticides, etc., that kills off the vital nutrients in the soil and kills off the vital microbes in the soil. So that pesticide kills the nutrient of the soil, and eventually you have a reduced crop yield and reduced soil fertility, and overall there is a reduction in soil productivity. This leads to soil degradation, causes soil degradation, and that in a way causes, or rather can lead to, desertification in the long run. Okay, then it has got various health implications and health damages that are associated with it as well. For example, it will cause breathing disorders because of the toxins and the fumes that it emits. It can cause skin diseases whenever you are exposed to any of these contaminants. It will cause the skin diseases. Release of heavy contaminants like lead in soil can impact the child's cognitive development. How? By entering into the food chain and impacting the nervous system. We have seen earlier as well that lead contamination and lead poisoning leads to a kind of a nervous disorder in a larger run. And landfills and waste dumping, they will lead to air pollution by releasing of fumes. Overall, reduced vegetation leads to barren land. That means if you have barren land, lesser green cover means what? Lesser absorption of CO2 by the plants. And when you have lesser absorption of CO2 by the plants, means increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that means increased global warming. That will be caused in the process. Then you have an ecological imbalance due to lesser productivity. Productivity, you have energy pyramid gets impacted. Okay, that energy pyramid, that is impacted. Imbalance in soil flora and fauna, including the microorganisms, water pollution. You have loss of topsoil as well. Why? Because as the land is barren, remains barren, the soil is prone to erosion. Habitat loss, risk of wildfire events. Why? Because of the gases such as methane which are released from the waste dumping due to large amount of flammable gases like methane released into the environment. Okay, from where? From the dump sites. Biomagnification and accumulation obviously will occur. In the urban areas, you have the clogging of the drains and the river channels as well, which causes devastating amount of floods, inundation of the various areas. You have a foul smell and release of gases, and the aesthetics of the urban area overall will also get impacted. Now, let us take a look at the various different prevention and control measures which have been put in place, which can be put into place in order to handle this waste. So, for that, we first of all talk about the aspect of integrated waste management. Now, what is that integrated waste management? This is ideally the principle which should be involved in order to manage the waste in a sustainable manner, where the waste can be managed in the long run process. So, when we talk about this here, the process of integrated waste management, it now when we talk about waste management, for most of us, the perception is that management of the waste is simply collection of the waste, disposing of the waste. But that is not even one portion of it. Waste management has got various different factors, and a complete paradigm of it comes right from the source where the waste is generated, you need to segregate the waste. You need to handle the waste carefully. You need to separate whether it is a solid waste, liquid waste, biodegradable, non-biodegradable waste. Now, once you have done that, then there needs to be a proper waste logistics, which can collect the waste on a daily basis, and all the waste which is generated, that is accounted for. Also, the legal standards that you have set, for example, do the chemical fertilizers also damage soil like pesticides? Absolutely, yes. Excess application of chemical fertilizers will always end up damaging the soil. And that is what is one of the major causes of soil degradation, which is leading to degradation and desertification of soil in the reaches of Haryana, Punjab, and Western UP, which is leading to lower agricultural productivity in these areas. So here, when we talk about that portion of integrated waste management, now this also involves the stages. For example, let's suppose an industry has been set or has been given a kind of a waste disposal target, or a kind of a target such as that your effluent or emission that you discharge should be this much clean or should contain lesser than this much amount of contaminant. Now in that situation, you need to follow it up, whether the industry is observing that or violating the norm. So let us take a look at the various different stages of waste management. First is, if you take a look at it, then waste disposal and facilities management. So here, where is it that you dispose of the waste? Is it something which is simply dumped into the open areas, or is it something which is, first of all, segregated, handled, and so on? Then legal compliance. That is the reportage of it. That, for example, the as I was telling you, the requirements, the legalities of it, the legal requirements for set for each of the industries by CPCB, whether the industries are following the norms or are they violating the norms openly. So that will come under the portion of legal compliance. This is for ensuring following of norms by set by the government body, right, in terms of the industrial emission, industrial discharge of effluents. Then you have the waste classification, the technical services, that is the whether there is enough research and development that also needs to be carried out, that how to utilize the waste, how to produce maximum efficiency of energy by utilizing and recycling of that waste, how to bring about a greater amount of economic opportunity for that. For example, as one of you pointed out, that in the region of Australia, you have a separate method for segregation of the waste from the rivers. Almost a similar method is followed for the segregation of waste or collection of the waste even from the sea and the marine areas. So, how can we utilize them in a greater manner? How is it that we can ensure a better adherence of norms for the waste generated? Then you have on site waste services, that is minimization of the waste, that is reduction in the waste generated, reduction in amount of waste generated, waste generated. Okay, then the recycling of it, the resource recovery, whether we are able to carry out an efficient resource recovery or not, whether we are able to recycle all the important components or not, do we have the technical know-how for the same? As I told you, in many of the informal sectors, the problem lies at the point where we don't know what to extract and how to extract. We don't know the utility of all of them. So that is where the resource recovery is very, very important. So that will include the recycling of the waste, the metals recovery, and the technical know-how to do the same. So this requires technical know-how. Okay. Then solid and liquid waste, they can be generated. Now they need to be treated differently, isn't it? You cannot treat them at the same time. You need to ensure that the liquid waste and the solid waste, they are not commingled and they are not basically seeping and leaching into the ground surface. Then commodity trading. What is that commodity trading? So let's say the recycled items which we have extracted from any type of waste, are we able to utilize them efficiently or not? Because presently, let's say a particular, you open a kind of a startup. Let's suppose you open a kind of a startup which takes care of the extraction of precious materials from the e-waste. Now you have extracted those precious elements. Now what do you do with that? That is something where you don't have much of a clue. What do we do with that? So that is where you need a proper commodity trading platform. Majority of these informal sectors, they trade in the recycled items in a black market, in an informal economy, which in a way is a testament of lack of transparency. If there is no transparency, there will never be any accountability for the pollution as well. Then comes the waste logistics. That is the handling and the transportation of the waste from the source to the end. So, handling and transportation of the waste from all sources, all the various different sources, and their disposal to the point of waste treatment. Okay. So that is basically a part of waste logistics. In our country, this is also where we have a significant amount of drawback, because the municipalities, they don't have enough money. Majority of the municipalities that you will observe, majority of them, they don't have enough sustainable income in order to handle that waste. Because once you get elected for a municipality, you have other priorities, political parties that you will have to contribute to, and various other aspects and other priorities. So there is no amount of sustainable income which is generated where they can augment their waste handling capacity. Most of the municipalities, as of now, you would observe they lack funds. So why will and how will they be investing in these mechanisms? So that is why we don't have the proper waste logistic facilities. From this particular portion, you can expect a kind of a mains question, which you can try to write it on your own as well. So discuss the impact of land pollution, then examine the aspects of integrated waste management. Okay, try to write it down. 15 words or 15 marks, 250 words. Okay, now here in 250 words, you have to examine both of them in detail. So ideally, in the initial portion, give around the introduction should be talking about the land pollution. So in the introduction, talk about that how land pollution is causing a major issue, and that is because of a lack of an integrated waste management setup present in most of the municipalities. And that will be your introduction, done and dusted. Then in the initial portion of the body, you talk about the various impacts of land pollution. Always, I would suggest that in this case, represent it with the help of a block diagram formation. That will be easier to understand for the evaluator as well, much more representative as well, and it will be much more rewarding from the exam point of view as well. And then talk about the aspects of waste management, where you talk about the various different measures. Any doubts that persist till now? Any doubts? Any issues? Any difficulty? Good. So now we move with the aspect of the methods to waste manage waste. We'll do one thing. We'll start this up after the lunch break. So let's take a lunch break, and we'll be back in an hour or so, and then we will initiate the discussion furthermore. And then we will be talking about what is biosparging, bioaugmentation, bioremediation, and various different aspects. Okay. Okay. So let's take a lunch break and let's be back.